The lawyer read out the will of our father, Brian. It stated that the inheritance would be passed on to my older brother, Paul. What was being read out included the family home and land where I grew up with my father, as well as the names and addresses of rural lands and vacant houses he owned. The lawyer continued in a matter-of-fact tone. To summarize the next part, it designated all of my father's debts, including unpaid hospital bills, funeral and burial expenses, as well as any cash and other assets not listed in the will, to my brother. I felt as if the world went dark before my eyes. In the end, all that was left for me was a condominium that my father had transferred the rights to just before passing away. I didn't want to leave our family home, but I couldn't afford the maintenance costs, and the house was too large for me to live in alone. So, I reluctantly took over the rights to the condominium, as my father had often suggested. But, considering my father's vast wealth, it was a mere pittance. "We did it! We did it, Paul! That man's wealth is now ours!" My mother, Mary, was overjoyed, her voice piercing in contrast to mine. Her irritating voice didn't even register to me in my apathetic state. "Ah, yes, Mom. I'm not thrilled we have to pay for Dad's funeral and burial, but considering his estate, it's a small price to pay." My brother laughed loudly. Since the funeral arrangements hadn't yet been made, our father hadn't been buried. The thought that these appalling voices might reach our father filled me with remorse. Yet, having been left nothing from the inheritance, I felt I had no right to speak up. Then, slowly, my brother turned to me, directing his crude laughter my way. "Ah, that's right. Despite all the care you provided Dad, you ended up with nothing from the inheritance." His words pierced my heart like a knife. To be precise, it's not that I received nothing. The only thing I was given was a room in the condominium, a way to keep the bothersome me away. If asked whether I was happy with it, it was not something to be joyful about. I wonder if I was just being used. My father took me in and raised me, all for his own sake in old age. And when he became bedridden, because I wasn't as useful as he hoped, he tried to distance me. Such oppressive thoughts clung to me and wouldn't let go. My name is Margaret. Currently, I live alone with my father, Brian. Previously, it was a family of 4 including my mother, Mary, and my brother, Paul, but my parents divorced when I was young due to my mother's infidelity. I was told about the cause of their divorce decades later, only recently. I don't have much memory of it, but honestly, I don't recall my mother treating me well. She always doted on my brother and seemed harsh towards me. Perhaps that's why, when my parents divorced, my brother went with my mother, and I was taken in by my father. I loved my father dearly. Despite being wealthy, after divorcing my mother, he chose not to hire a maid, which he could have, and instead raised me single-handedly. He always attended school events, and when I needed a lunchbox, he would clumsily but earnestly prepare one. Even though he often returned home late on weekdays due to work, he would actively do housework on weekends. For instance, if I wanted to bake cookies, he would join me, despite being unaccustomed to it, much like a mother would. Despite being busy juggling housework, work, and parenting, he occasionally took me out for fun. With my mother absent, he poured all his love into me, acting as both a father and a mother. That's why I was fine even when occasionally bullied for having only one parent. I have my dad, and that's all that matters. I felt no anxiety or dissatisfaction without my mother. In fact, I preferred it that way. The reason being, my mother was irresponsible with money. To fulfill his duties as a father, my dad continued to communicate with my mother and brother through calls and emails to pay child support. I could understand that much. However, my mother and brother were never satisfied with just that. They frequently contacted my dad to extort more money. This was evident from the excessive number of calls from my mother and my dad's reactions of dismay and sometimes anger towards the person on the other end of the phone. After the calls, my dad would always reassure me that everything was okay. However, having heard my mother's name mentioned during those calls, it was easy for me to imagine that she was irresponsible with money. So for me, having my dad is all I need. I don't need a mother. I wished that our relationship wouldn't get any worse if possible. I hoped so. But fate is cruel, and sadly, no matter how hard I try, I can't change the fact that I am a child who inherits half of her blood. I was reminded of this when my father fell ill and, despite treatment, became bedridden. "Dad, your meal is ready." I entered the room with a tray holding meals for two, after knocking lightly 3 times. The scent of spring wafted in through the window that had been opened for ventilation. "Margaret, I'm sorry for always." "Hey, we agreed you wouldn't say that anymore." It was like a scene from an old movie. A smile involuntarily spilled from me, though my father still wore a face full of regret. "Look, if you keep making that face, you won't be able to get better. Let's eat together." I placed the tray on the bedside table and slowly adjusted the angle of the care bed. Then, after announcing what I was about to do, I gently cleaned inside my father's mouth. This was a caregiving technique I learned from Christopher, who helps with my father's care when I'm at work. This makes it easier for the person to taste food and enjoy their meal. After finishing the cleaning, I reached for the food prepared for my father. One might think of liquid diets for bedridden patients, but according to professionals like Christopher, that's not always necessary. Swallowing and chewing abilities vary from person to person, even among those who are bedridden. What's important is choosing the right food for the individual. Although my father's ability to chew has weakened, his ability to swallow hasn't declined much. Therefore, his meals look almost like regular food. Of course, I prepared visually similar meals for myself so my father wouldn't feel lonely. I scooped up a bite of my father's meal with a spoon. "Here you go." He obediently took it into his mouth when I brought it to his lips. I watched as he chewed slowly and swallowed. Then, I took a bite of my own meal. And again, I scooped up another bite for my father and brought it to his lips. This was our routine. "Margaret, what's wrong? Are you full already?" I was careful with the amount of food. But I'm just an amateur without any formal caregiving qualifications. I couldn't deny that I still had a lot to learn in that area. "I think it might be better if I went into a facility." "That conversation again? I told you before, I'm fine. You raised me all this time. Let me repay the favor." I tried to sound cheerful and unbothered. But my father's words hurt me. He often said he should go into a facility, that he would leave me the condominium he owned. Whether he was trying to be considerate or if he genuinely thought amateur care was too stressful, I couldn't tell. If I were in my father's position, I probably would feel the latter. Maybe there is a limit to home care after all. I shook my head to dispel the sinking feeling. I'm not alone. I hired Christopher, a professional caregiver, to manage home care. We should be able to manage somehow. That's what I decided when the ringtone of my father's mobile phone interrupted my thoughts. After my father became bedridden, I changed the ringtone settings to something identifiable by sound alone for certain callers, albeit without his permission. The distinctive ringtone sounded, and I frowned unintentionally. "Aren't you going to answer that?" "Yeah, it's okay. It's probably nothing important anyway." My father looked like he wanted to say something but ultimately didn't. He probably knew who was calling from my reaction. The caller was my mother. Technically my mother, and for my father, the person currently raising his biological son. I couldn't avoid telling her when my father became bedridden. When I informed her of the situation, her unbelievable response was still clear in my mind. "Oh, really? And when is the funeral? Paul will inherit something, right?" I remember the words she said at that time and the anger I felt. My father is still alive and bedridden. Yet all she cares about is inheritance and money. Since then, whenever I answer the phone on behalf of my father, I make sure never to pick up calls from her. I felt bad for my father, but I had already changed the ringtone to identify her calls quickly. It wasn't that I hadn't considered the possibility of her calling about something else. But the child support payments my father had been making were already settled. And considering she brought up the inheritance first thing after hearing about my father's condition, I can't imagine her calling almost daily for casual conversation. Considering my father's condition, it's more natural to assume she was checking if the inheritance could be claimed, not out of concern for him. Why should I have to answer such a disrespectful call? Moreover, my brother Paul hasn't shown his face even once, likely influenced by our selfish and negligent mother. My brother, whom I barely remember now, has not visited this house once since our father fell ill. While there were adult reasons for him not visiting when our father was well, he is still our father despite the divorce. Wouldn't human decency dictate at least one visit? But expecting anything from them is futile. A mother who's far from decent and a brother likely influenced by her. Relying on such former family members, who are more of a hindrance than a help, is pointless. I should just do the best I can. And so, despite being treated coldly by my father, with considerable help from Christopher, 2 years passed, and my father finally passed away. At last, the day has come. My mother's unpleasant voice echoed in the living room. Beside her sat my brother, who I was seeing for the first time in a while, acting all high and mighty. I was sitting across the table from these two unpleasant people, along with the lawyer who had helped draft my father's will. I didn't want to inform my mother about my father's death. But it wasn't something that could be hidden forever. Plus, my father had left behind a substantial inheritance. Funeral arrangements were still pending. So, when I reluctantly informed my mother of my father's passing, she openly rejoiced over the phone and immediately talked about coming over to discuss the inheritance. The funeral hadn't even taken place yet. Nevertheless, I had to inconvenience the lawyer to arrange this meeting. Here is the will left by Brian. Cut the preamble and just show it to us. Like mother, like son. My brother interrupted and demanded hastily. I'm sorry. I apologized to the lawyer, who shook his head as if to say it didn't matter. I will now proceed to open it on his behalf. Excuse me. With that, the lawyer used a paper knife to break the seal. The letter that emerged bore the same date and name as on the envelope, written in my father's handwriting. The lawyer read out my father, Brian's will. It stated that the inheritance would be passed on to my older brother, Paul. What was read included the family home and land I grew up on with my father, as well as the names and addresses of rural lands and vacant houses he owned. The lawyer continued in a matter-of-fact tone. To summarize, it designated all of my father's debts, including unpaid hospital bills, funeral and burial expenses, as well as any cash and other assets not listed in the will, to my brother. I felt as if the world went dark before my eyes. In the end, all that was left for me was a condominium that my father had transferred the rights to just before passing away. I didn't want to leave our family home, but I couldn't afford the maintenance costs, and the house was too large for me to live in alone. So, I reluctantly took over the rights to the condominium, as my father had often suggested. But, considering my father's vast wealth, it was a mere pittance. We did it! We did it, Paul! That man's wealth is now ours. My mother rejoiced, her voice piercing in contrast to mine. Her irritating voice didn't even register to me in my apathetic state. Ah, yes, Mom. I'm not thrilled we have to pay for Dad's funeral and burial, but considering his estate, it's a small price to pay. My brother laughed crudely. Since the funeral arrangements hadn't yet been made, our father hadn't been buried. The thought that these appalling voices might reach our father filled me with remorse. Yet, having been left nothing from the inheritance, I felt I had no right to speak up. Then, casually, my brother turned to me, directing his crude laughter my way. Ah, that's right. Despite all the care you provided Dad, you ended up with nothing from the inheritance. His words pierced my heart like a knife. To be precise, it's not that I received nothing. The only thing I was given was a room in the condominium, a way to keep the bothersome me away. If asked whether I was happy with it, it was not something to be joyful about. I wonder if I was just being used. My father took me in and raised me, all for his own sake in old age. And when he became bedridden, because I wasn't as useful as he hoped, he tried to distance me. Such oppressive thoughts clung to me and wouldn't let go. Afterward, the lawyer and my brother were exchanging some documents, but all of that just went in one ear and out the other for me. I honestly couldn't care less by then. The unbelievable mother, the brother who followed in her footsteps, and even the father whom I believed loved me, all of it. Several days have passed since that disastrous inheritance day. As per the will, my brother is currently arranging our father's funeral. But he seems to want to minimize the expenses. He's getting quotes from multiple places, and the funeral arrangements are not moving forward. Dad would be so sad about this. I mutter softly, my voice quietly spreading. We can't just kick you out and look like the bad guys. My brother said, allowing me to stay in our family home until the funeral is over. It must also have meant keeping watch over my father's body, but honestly, it didn't matter where I was. Being at the family home would involuntarily bring back memories of my father. But returning to the condo I was given didn't make things any better. I preferred staying at the family home as much as possible, rather than letting my brothers desecrate the home filled with memories. That's when I suddenly remembered that day. My mother and brother, who took off gleefully without even looking at his face after getting their hands on my father's inheritance. After seeing them off, the lawyer quietly handed me something. Margaret, this is something I'm holding not as a lawyer, but as a friend of your father. Brian entrusted me to give this to his daughter if anything happened to me. Unfortunately, as the will states, this, and everything inside it, will belong to Paul. But you might be able to check what's inside if you return it, he said, handing me an old key. According to the lawyer, it was the key to a drawer in my father's desk. What could it possibly be now? Perhaps a letter filled with grievances against me at the very end. I was reluctant, but I didn't want my father's belongings to be mishandled by my brothers without my knowledge. Shaking off my hesitation, I stepped into my father's study for the first time in a while. The air was a bit stagnant in the room that had been closed up recently, but I thought I could slightly smell my father. I shook off the sentimentality that was about to engulf me and first opened the windows for ventilation. Then I approached the desk and unlocked the drawer. The drawer opened more easily than I expected. Inside was a thick letter with my name on it. It was in my father's familiar handwriting. Perhaps it was filled with complaints about me, as I expected. With a heavy heart, I reached for the unsealed letter to check its contents. Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm probably no longer in this world. The letter began with a mix of formalities and jests, or perhaps it was just my father's way of joking, as if out of a story. The letter contained various things. He was glad to have taken me in, but wondered if he'd be being clumsy, could really raise a daughter. Being a single parent, had he made me feel lonely? He was anxious that I would hate him when I hit puberty. The anxiety of a parent of the opposite sex, especially one who was admittedly clumsy. But contrary to his fears, I continued to treat him the same even after reaching adolescence, which was something he vividly remembered as a happy memory. Therefore, he felt terribly sorry and guilty for making me take care of him when he became bedridden. He wanted me to live freely without worrying about him and to be happy. His clumsy love was written about over several pages. Dad. My vision began to blur naturally. It would be terrible to wet this letter and have my brother, who has ownership, say something about it. I quickly wiped my tears with the sleeve of my clothes. I knew nothing. Not my father's feelings, his kindness, or even about the condo. If it was as this letter said, it must have been out of consideration for me. And he had even suggested moving into a facility several times. In the empty study, the sound of my sniffing quietly echoed. There was more to the letter. I continued reading without worrying. My pace gradually slowed. What? Yes, a series of shocking, cold facts that contrasted sharply with the warm content before. It was about my mother and brother, something I knew nothing about. The land and property my father left to my brother were almost worthless, including this family home. The building that had become vacant, my father had it appraised beforehand, knowing it wouldn't sell. There were other facts I didn't know. My father had been a guarantor for a business run by a friend. Of course, after my father passed away, as stated in the will, the position of guarantor was literally passed on to my brother, who inherited everything. This included my father's negative legacy. But why? This seemed like harassment towards my brother and mother. Regardless of my mother, even though he hadn't shown his face since falling ill, my brother was still his child, wasn't he? The fact that he was paying child support was proof of that. My questions were answered in the next letter. Margaret, what I'm about to write may seem unbelievable, but please accept it as the truth. Your brother Paul. He's not my child. I might have mentioned it before. Mary had an affair. The child born from that affair with her partner was Paul. Embarrassingly, I only realized Paul wasn't my biological son when I noticed Mary's odd behavior towards you. At that time, I learned of Mary's affair and that Paul was not my own flesh and blood. Nonetheless, I decided to treat Paul as my son, blood-related or not. Thus, even after we divorced and Paul was taken by Mary, I continued to pay child support until he was an adult. But that was naive. The demands from Mary and her side only grew more intense. Moreover, they argued that if there was money for Margaret, it should be paid to them instead. I couldn't bear Mary's attitude, speaking ill of you even after we separated, seeing me only as a source of money. So, I thought of revenge on Mary and her. I decided to pass on the worthless land and the role of guarantor to Paul. I was dumbfounded by all this. I knew about my mother's affair, but I had no idea that my brother was a child from that affair. However, this explained why my mother's attitude towards me and my brother was so drastically different. And indeed, my mother, who drove my father to such revenge, was a terrible person. But there was one flaw in this plan. It meant that I couldn't leave anything to you, Margaret. I felt terribly sorry and guilty about this. After some research and with the help of a friend, I learned about lifetime gifts. This required the consent of both me and Margaret, but it would allow me to pass on a small part of my estate to you. Of course, if Mary found out about this lifetime gift, she would do anything to obstruct it. Worse, there was a chance that Paul would renounce all the estate he inherited. So, I had no choice but to leave my condominium to you under a false pretense, knowing it would hurt you. Margaret, I don't expect forgiveness. I regret lying and hurting you, even though I felt I had no choice. Lastly, Margaret. Thank you for growing up to be such a kind person. I felt sorry for making you care for me, but at the same time, I was also truly happy. From now on, live truly for yourself. And become even happier than before. I love you, always and forever. I'm always wishing for your happiness. So that's how it was. Tears, unstoppable, traced down my cheeks one after another. I wasn't treated as a nuisance by my father. He was desperately trying to protect me, clumsy as he might have been. I'm sorry, Dad. I misunderstood. I'm sorry for thinking I was a nuisance. I'm sorry for not realizing your kindness until now. My tearful apology echoed emptily in the room where no one was present. Years have passed since my father's funeral. Since then, I've been living in the condominium my father left me. My relationship with Christopher started due to my father's care, and now we are blessed with children and everything seems to be going smoothly. A few months after the funeral, I only received one call from my mother and brother. Well, that might give the wrong impression. It was after that one call that I blocked my mother and brother's phone numbers. The reason was simple. It was about the inheritance my brother took over from our father. When I answered the phone, my brother first vented his frustrations towards my father and me. Are you kidding me? That old man's land and buildings are worth nothing at all. I wasn't even told about the co-signing. You two must have tricked me, you fraudsters, were his words. When I suggested he could just disinherit if he was so displeased, he said it was too late after 3 months had passed. Moreover, he claimed that due to this, our mother became stressed, weakened, and eventually bedridden. How are you going to take responsibility for this? I'll sue you, he cursed bitterly. Honestly, I didn't see it as my concern. Indeed, it ended up looking like we tricked him, but it was my brothers who eagerly proceeded with the inheritance of all our father's assets without proper investigation. It wasn't my place to be blamed. Realizing it was a waste of time to argue, I unilaterally ended the call and immediately blocked my brother and mother's numbers. However, I couldn't just ignore it if he decided to sue. So I asked the lawyer who helped us with my father's inheritance to intervene. I regularly receive updates via email, and it seems things are going somewhat smoothly so far. Dad, I'm happy now. As my child slept in my arms, bathed in the spring breeze, a small smile spilled out. Indeed, I'm still a bit troubled by the issues with my brother and mother, but I have supportive people around me and a husband who stands by me. And I've been blessed with a healthy, thriving child. To be honest, I still regret not being able to show my father his grandchild's face, but I'm sure that living my days filled with smiles is the best way to honor him. Christopher, and with this child, will be happy together. That's what I swore once again to my father, who I believe is in heaven. Can't believe we're meeting here of all places. To think someone like you, a loser, could make it to Italy. Without a care for my distress, Rala, a former friend, sneered disgustingly. Beside Rala stood Jim, a doctor, and my former fiancé. I had lost Jim, once my lover, to Rala. Who's this guy? Where did you pick up this poor soul? How many decades of savings did you spend to get here? After looking down on me, they turned their attention to my husband next to me. Hey, know your place, poor man. Where do you work? Jim said, patting my husband's shoulder arrogantly. Rala and Jim, having had their fun at our expense, soon found their smiles vanishing with my husband's next words. Don't you realize who I am? What followed was a literal hell for the two of them. My name is Nancy, 48 years old. I work as a nurse in a general hospital. Having graduated from a vocational school, I've moved between hospitals but always worked as a nurse. Since childhood, I was timid and even afraid of the sight of blood, but I fell seriously ill in middle school. I vividly remember thinking I was going to die. It was such a severe illness. Crushed by anxiety, I was greatly encouraged by the nurses at the hospital where I was admitted. If I said I was too scared to sleep, they would sit by my side until I could, keeping me company. On the day of my surgery, "It's going to be okay," they reassured me over and over. Their dedicated care helped me overcome my illness. This experience significantly changed the future of a timid person like me. The thought of giving back the life I was saved inspired me to pursue a career in nursing. I've been all about work for a long time, but now I live with my husband Ben, whom I married 8 years ago. He is 5 years older than me, a reliable and dependable person. By the year we got married, I was over 40 and had given up on having children. When proposed to, I confessed this feeling honestly. Then, "As long as I can live with Nancy, that's all I need." He embraced me. That's how we came to be a working couple, living freely together. I met my husband about 2 years before we got married, and it had been about 10 years since I last dated. I always had the desire to marry from when I was young. However, there's a reason I stayed away from romance for so long. It might be a common reason, but I was deeply hurt in my younger days. Betrayed by someone I trusted, I decided I didn't want to experience that kind of pain again. To tell this story, we have to go back about 20 years. Back then, in my 20s, I was working as a nurse at a different hospital. It was there I fell in love with Jim, a surgeon. Jim was a good-looking young man with distinct features, popular among female patients and nurses alike. Despite hearing some not-so-great rumors about his relationships, my younger self didn't care about any of that. Being timid and having never dated anyone before, I was surprisingly proactive this time. Since I was assigned to surgery, I had many chances to talk to Jim and desperately tried to make an impression. We went out for meals with colleagues a few times, and gradually, Jim and I became closer. It seems Jim didn't harbor any bad feelings towards me, who had admired him for a long time. Eventually, Jim asked me out, and our love blossomed. Rala, a friend from my vocational school days who also worked at the same hospital, was surprised by this fact. Rala, working in internal medicine, couldn't believe I was dating Jim, whose popularity spanned the entire hospital. Nevertheless, Rala was overjoyed for me, as if it were her own happiness. Rala was the exact opposite of me. While I was plain and timid, she had always been stylish and a leader since our school days. Despite our differences, we became close because our seats were near each other. Rala seemed a bit intimidating at first, but she was actually bright, straightforward, and pleasant to be around. She often helped me out in times of trouble, and eventually, we became what you could call best friends. Then, we both ended up working at this hospital, which accepted many students for practical training. Even though we were in different departments, our relationship continued as before. 2 years into my relationship with Jim, marriage naturally came up in conversation. Still in my 20s, I thought it ideal to marry early, have children, and support Jim as a doctor's wife. Jim formally proposed, and we got engaged. It seemed Jim too wished for me to be a stay-at-home wife. He talked about wanting children and passing on his legacy. Our relationship was known not just in the surgery department, but throughout most of the hospital. I remember the female nurses seemed disappointed that Jim was finally getting married. With the engagement settled, I thought it natural to have a family meeting, so I suggested a dinner with both our parents. However, Jim was hesitant to accept this idea. "It's important, I know, but you're aware of how busy I am, right?" It's hard to match schedules with my parents. Every time I asked about his parents' availability, he would dodge the question. Working closely with Jim, I was aware of his busy schedule, so although I found it somewhat odd, I believed him. This situation continued for over 6 months, and even my parents, who knew we were engaged, started to worry. "Why hasn't he come to meet us yet?" my father angrily questioned. My own anxiety grew by the day, and I found myself distracted at work. With a job that involves people's lives, I couldn't let this continue. I told Jim about my parents' worries. Then, Jim answered with a look of annoyance. Marriage, you're so nagging about it." "I've changed my mind, the engagement is off." Jim said this without changing his expression, as if discarding the thought. "What? What are you talking about? You're joking, right?" I called out desperately to Jim as he was about to leave, but he never spoke another word. The subtle distance between Jim and me over the past few months seemed obvious to those around us. News of my breakup with Jim spread quickly throughout the hospital. Nurses in the same department didn't say anything directly to me, but various rumors started circulating. Some said I was too eager to marry, or that my jealousy was too strong and I had tried to control Jim. All were common, fabricated stories, but one in particular was hard to ignore. It was rumored that Jim had a new lover. Of course, no colleague would discuss such things in front of me, so I decided to ask directly. "I know there are all sorts of rumors, but where did you hear that the doctor has a new lover?" My unexpected, pointed question made the air tense. "Sorry, I didn't mean to tease. There are various stories about Dr. Jim because he's involved in many things." They continued, looking apologetic. "I don't know if it's true, and I wasn't going to tell you, but..." The colleague seemed unsure whether to continue. I pressed for more details from my hesitant colleague. "It's just a rumor, but someone said they saw Dr. Jim getting close with Rolla from internal medicine." At the mention of Rolla's name, my mind momentarily froze. "Rolla. You're good friends with Rolla, right? That's why the story has blown up even more." My colleague sighed heavily, looking at me. "I shouldn't say this now, but it's better to stay away from Jim. If this story is true, Rolla is going to end up in a worse situation." Hearing this from my colleague made my mood sink even further. If this story was true, it meant I was betrayed by my best friend. Betrayed by both my lover and my best friend, I would lose them both. Thinking about it made me not want to confront Rolla directly. But looking back, I realized I hadn't talked much with Rolla in these past few months. Once doubt started, my anxiety overflowed, growing more and more. I decided to invite Rolla for a meal after work, resolving to face whatever came. Meeting Rolla after a long time, she seemed insincere, overly surprised to hear about my breakup with Jim. "You broke up? That's too bad, especially after getting engaged." The Rolla I knew before would have been more empathetic when I was sad. But the Rolla in front of me didn't seem sad at all. Instead, I could see an undeniable joy hidden in her eyes. I shouldn't be saying this to Rolla, but... As I talked, I became convinced I needed to ask Rolla directly. "Do you know the rumor about you dating Jim?" I asked hesitantly, to which Rolla responded without changing her expression. "Eh? Yeah, I know. It's true." Stunned, I was left speechless by the matter-of-factly delivered fact. Rolla continued while picking at the food laid out on the table. "I thought you had realized by now. To think you weren't sure until you asked me." Rolla continued as if she hadn't done anything wrong. "I've been involved with Jim for quite a while now. To put it bluntly, you were dumped." Rolla glared at me as she tilted her glass of wine. "Are we done here?" Our friendship ends with this." Saying that, Rala left $100 on the table and stood up. I couldn't move from my spot for a while after Rala left. I had a bad feeling but never believed it would become reality. Betrayed by a friend I was so close to, I couldn't even cry anymore. Soon after, I resigned from the hospital. Betrayed by someone I trusted, I continued to distract myself by working hard. Time passed, and before I knew it, I was nearing 40 when I started dating my current husband, Ben. Knowing my past and understanding my inability to trust men, Ben took his time to heal my wounds one by one, initially as a friend. That's how I eventually married him. Our marriage has been peaceful, and our relationship remains strong. Though I work, my husband has an even busier schedule. One day, he had to go to Italy for work. It was his first business trip abroad, and I was full of questions, driven by curiosity. "If you're so interested, why don't we make a trip out of it and go together?" I couldn't immediately be happy about my husband's unexpected suggestion. "But you're going for work." My husband laughed and responded, "Our company is flexible about these things. It's okay. We can sightsee in between my work." Hesitant, I was, but my husband went ahead and planned our trip to Italy as a couple. Despite the invitation, I felt audacious for tagging along on my husband's work trip. Upon arriving in Italy, my timid nature took over, and I regretted my decision. Sensing this, my husband reassured me multiple times that it was okay. For safety, I was to stay in the hotel while he worked. The hotel was luxurious, like something out of a movie, complete with an indoor pool. There were even shops within the hotel, ensuring I wouldn't get bored while waiting. I spent my time enjoying sweets and tea at the cafe, reading. "Tomorrow, I don't have work. Shall we go sightseeing?" my husband suggested when he returned to the hotel. "But aren't you tired from working all day?" I expressed concern for his well-being, but he assured me with a smile that he was fine. Grateful for his kindness, we decided to go sightseeing together the next day. It was my first time abroad, and I was overwhelmed by the sights of Rome. The beautiful streets, the famous landmarks I had seen on TV and in books. Walking through the city with my husband was a blissful moment. As we were heading back to the hotel after finishing our pasta, someone unexpectedly called out to me. "Nancy?" The voice from a distant memory made my body freeze. Despite hoping it was a lie, I couldn't forget that voice. Turning around apprehensively, there stood Jim, my former fiancé, and Rala. Both had aged, but seeing them instantly brought back the nightmare vividly. Rala, holding luxury accessories and a bag, looked at me with the same cold eyes as the last time we spoke. Jim, adorned in tasteless jewelry, looked down on me with evident disdain. "We got married after all that. I'm working at a big hospital now, busier than ever before." Before I knew it, my hands started trembling. "Nancy, what's wrong? Are you okay?" My past traumas resurfaced, leaving me almost in a panic. To think we'd meet here. That a loser like you could afford to come to Italy. Rala said this with a sneer, uncaring as I held my head in distress. "And who's this? Which poor soul did you catch? How many years of savings did you spend to get here?" Watching the two, my husband seemed to realize that these were the people who had hurt me in the past. "How much more do you need to hurt her before you're satisfied? Leave her alone." My usually gentle husband raised his voice for me. "Eh? She's the one who got too serious and annoyingly clingy. Poor people should just stay quiet." Jim said this and arrogantly patted my husband's shoulder. "Hey! Don't be rude. I'm a doctor. You can't even imagine, but I can spend hospital money however I want. Know your place. Amidst a crowd of tourists, Jim was practically frothing at the mouth. Enough. I don't want people like you insulting my husband. My timid self shouted as loud as I could, surprising Jim and Rolla. They seemed taken aback for a moment, but then looked at each other and laughed. What are you saying? If you don't want to be made fun of, just disappear. Rolla muttered while laughing. Do you enjoy belittling people? Rolla, didn't you realize you were being played too? My words twisted Rolla's face. It was a painful truth she didn't want to face, aware of it herself. What are you talking about, loser? Rolla screamed as if losing control, ready to lunge at me. Then, my husband stepped between me and Rolla. Don't come any closer to my wife. Rolla's movements halted under the imposing presence of my husband, who was close at hand. Having calmed down, Rolla then backed away. What's the matter with you? How dare you losers have an opinion about us? Rolla, face flushed with anger, started yelling. The sight of adults screaming in public was embarrassing for those watching. Jim joined in, escalating the situation into a small commotion. Some tourists even started filming the scene with their mobile phones. I wondered if this would spread online. A concern given my profession. Seeing the commotion, my husband stepped forward as if he had made up his mind, confronting Rolla and Jim. Don't you realize who I am? Standing before the two, my husband sighed and then spoke. Eh? Both were startled by my husband's words. Think you can use the hospital's money as you please? That poor people don't matter? Do you not even know the face of the hospital director you work for? Jim's face paled as he grasped my husband's identity. Though he couldn't believe that what he feared was actually happening. After all, we were in Italy. No way! Jim's visible distress also began to worry Rolla, who had never seen Jim, always so arrogant and confident, look so defeated. Embarrassing his wife with such a pathetic display seemed irrelevant now. Jim could only desperately hope he was wrong. Let me introduce myself. My name is Ben. As my husband revealed his name, Jim sat down, resigned. It can't be. This is Italy. Why would the director be here? Rolla, realizing the situation, looked back and forth between me and my husband. Yes, my husband is the director of a major hospital. And Jim, unaware, had been working at my husband's hospital. I was shocked when I casually read my husband's hospital pamphlet and saw Jim's name. Unable to hide my shock, I honestly shared my past with Jim. After learning about my and Jim's past, my husband considered firing Jim. However, Jim's skills as a doctor were undeniable, and personal issues alone couldn't justify his dismissal. Firing Jim for my personal reasons would compromise my husband's position. I calmed my angry husband, and Jim was not fired. I didn't know you were so foolish. To embezzle hospital funds, have some shame. Once we return to America, I'll take you to the police. Jim, by exposing his wrongdoing, had sealed his fate to lose his job. Facing criminal charges back in America, he was visibly set to lose everything. Rolla, witnessing this exchange, scolded Jim. You didn't even know the director of your own hospital? What will you do now? Who was it that said everything would stay hidden? It seemed Rolla was aware of Jim's financial misconduct. Knowing this, she had indulged in a lavish lifestyle. With Jim's self-exposure, Rolla's way of life could no longer continue as before. More than worrying about her husband, Rolla seemed concerned about the impact on her lifestyle. The love between two people built on deception was, after all, just as it appeared. Watching Rolla continue to berate Jim, I felt terribly uncomfortable. I remembered what a colleague had said when rumors about Jim and Rolla first surfaced. Rolla will end up in a worse situation. The person berating her own husband was no longer the Rolla who had been my close friend. After scolding Jim, who was unable to recover from the shock, Rolla looked at us and clicked her tongue. My life's a mess because of you too. Understand? She blamed us as if she had done nothing wrong. Speaking of which, Rolla works at Mike's hospital, right? I recalled hearing from a colleague that Rolla had moved to another hospital after leaving the one where she and Jim had worked. I couldn't just stand there and take her accusations. What? Why do you know that? Sensing the unfavorable turn of events, Rolla looked uneasy. Shouldn't we let Mike know about this? I asked my husband with feigned naivety. Yes, we should. If she knew about Jim's misconduct, it's only right to inform Mike. Mike is a hospital director and a college friend of my husband's with whom he still keeps in touch. Ironically, Jim and Rolla both ended up working within my reach. Are you threatening me? Rolla, aware of her complicity in wrongdoing, approached us with a flushed face. Threaten? We want nothing from you. It's just that Mike, a friend of my husband, should know. Besides, once Jim is arrested, it'll come out anyway, so it's the same whether we say it or not. I couldn't help but add a touch of sarcasm in my response to Rolla. Hearing this, Rolla finally gave up and sat down beside Jim. Amidst the crowd of tourists, the sight of the two sitting and crying attracted even more attention. Let's go. We shouldn't waste our trip on this. My husband said this as he looked at the two weeping figures. After a few more days of sightseeing in Italy, we returned home. My husband, considerate of me, took me to various tourist attractions. The main reason for my husband's trip to Italy was to attend a seminar by a prestigious Italian doctor. He seemed satisfied with what he had learned at the seminar and its implications for his work. I wondered if Jim and Rolla might flee the country to escape criminal charges, but they didn't have the courage. Upon our return, Jim was immediately fired from the hospital as my husband had declared. A detailed investigation into the funds he had embezzled for research and equipment purchases exposed all his misdeeds. As a result, Jim faced criminal charges and was sentenced to prison. Rolla, needless to say, also lost her job. After my husband spoke to Mike, the hospital director, we learned that Rolla's reputation was quite poor. She had been boastful about her surgeon husband and often lorded it over her colleagues. The Rolla I knew was a woman who worked diligently with her patients' best interests at heart, but her reputation among patients was also terrible. Unbeknownst to me, Rolla seemed to have changed drastically over time. Though not as severely punished as Jim, Rolla also faced criminal charges for embezzling my husband's money. From their demeanor in Italy, I gathered that she had divorced Jim. Jim, who had wanted children as his successors, surprisingly had none with Rolla. It's likely that Rolla can no longer work as a nurse, a job she had for decades. The fact that she was the wife of a doctor who stole hospital funds will never leave her. Our encounter in Italy dramatically altered their fate. They probably never imagined their misdeeds would be exposed so far from home. I felt fear at this coincidence and was reminded that wrongdoing eventually comes to light. As for my husband and me, the incident seemed to strengthen our bond. We both stood up to them, angered by the insult to the person we love. While I could tolerate insults directed at myself, I couldn't bear those aimed at my loved one. Moreover, my husband must have been very uncomfortable meeting my former lover. He probably didn't want to see the face of such a person. Keeping Jim employed at his hospital must have been difficult for him. Yet, he continues to care for me as always. I'm deeply grateful for my husband's love and vow to stay by his side forever.